Welcome back to Warzones and Outpost podcast with myself, James Glancy, and Tom Tugendhat. We are back on the Iran-USA war, but today we're also going to look at the emerging problems with the Houthis in the Bab al-Mandeb choke point between Yemen and Somalia, and potentially another front where America, Donald Trump, is looking to get involved in the conflict in Mali to hold back al-Qaeda adjacent forces there. Tom, we keep saying how long we've been discussing this conflict, but there is a dynamic that has changed significantly, according to General Dan Kane, who has warned that U.S. air defense or missile stocks are so low that they actually are pushing for a ceasefire, or at least pushing for the pace of airstrikes and missile strikes to slow down against Iran, because they fired so many interceptors, particularly the Patriot missiles. They say that since the beginning of the war, they fired 1,500, and that they're down to the last 1,000, and they can't make them quick enough to replenish them. But I'm just wondering, from your point of view, how much the pressure for this ceasefire also comes from partners within the GCC as much as it comes from generals, and as a result of depleting US inventories.
Well, it comes from all of them. And, I went to Stanford Business School to give a talk the other day. And one of the points I made, which is beginning to really come home, is the fact that we're really good at making exquisite items, the high tech, the clever thing that, avoids or dodges or strikes. What we're less good at making these days is the mass. And of course, what the Iranians are very good at making, and the Russians, by the way, as well, is the mass volume stuff. So it may be cheap, it may not be quite as accurate, it may not be quite as good, but if you make 1,000 when we make one, guess what? Some of them are going to get through. And that is exactly what we're seeing here. So we're seeing a real change or rather a real clash, forgive me, in the types of warfare. We fight the exquisite, they fight the bulk. And it really does mean that we're mismatched. In some ways we outclass, in others they outgun, and so we need to be cognizant of what we're doing. And of course, what this means is it means our partners in the region, the Gulfies, the Saudis, whoever, are all looking around, because if the Americans haven't got the kit, you can be absolutely certain that they aren't selling it on to anybody else, which means everybody else is short. So they're now beginning to talk to President Zelensky of Ukraine, who has demonstrated, let's be frank, over the last 3-4 years, how you can resist, how you can stop Russian attacks, and that's pretty similar to Iranian attacks on the grounds they're pretty connected. Using cheap kit, you can make at home in bulk, and that is a really big change in the nature of warfare and the nature of alliances.
You make a really interesting point, because I remember at the beginning of the conflict, when Russia, well, not say the beginning, but when Russia reinvaded Ukraine, one of the focuses was in the Black Sea, was denying and destroying the remainder of the Ukrainian fleet and submarines. And back then, I thought, well, that's it for Ukraine, for controlling the sea, from having any influence over its coastline, the ability to defend against an amphibious attack, because conventionally, without a navy, it's very difficult to hold the maritime environment. And yet here we are, 5 years later, and they have been able to deny access to that body of water using drones and using uncrewed surface vessels. It just shows you how quickly technology has adapted. We saw the sinking of the Moskva a few years ago, but now these USVs and raid operations by Ukrainian special forces is even making life difficult, resupplying Crimea. They're having to put these huge barges and protective systems to stop bombs on uncrewed boats blowing up the supports on the bridges. Now, I want to come back to Iran, but I just thought it is a good example of how clearly the Russians have a significant fleet, and yet they're unable to deploy it, and they don't want to use any capital ships against these much cheaper drones. And really, this what was David versus Goliath has been neutralized, and there's far more parity. And America's really learning, is it not learning that lesson against Iran? Okay, they destroyed pretty much the entire Iranian navy, and probably a majority of their conventional exquisite assets, whether it's their aircraft, whether they're the larger missile systems, and yet they're still able to close the Straits of Hormuz. They're still able to defy America, and they're able to hold out.
Well, look, you and I fought together in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we both saw different ways in which, top-end militaries, in our case, the British, were up against sometimes a ragtag military, as it was in Iraq, or sometimes a ragtag militia, as it was in Afghanistan. And it's just true that you can knock out some of the exquisite stuff, whether that's, the sniper guy in the team, or whether it's the bloke with the particularly accurate mortar, or whatever it happens to be. But if they have enough people, if they have enough bulk, there's still a problem. And that's what we're seeing here. And actually, it's interesting that we're seeing the Iranians expanding the theater while the Americans are trying to reduce it. And this is something I wanted to talk to you about, which was the Bab al-Mandeb Straits, because we've seen Saudi attacks on the Houthis. This isn't the first time. The Saudis have been attacking Yemen in various different ways over the last decade or so. Where are we going here, and what's the latest you've heard?
The most worrying development came around Friday or Saturday when the Houthis targeted Yanbu. Yanbu is a really, really important port in the Red Sea because it is the host of the pipeline, the East-West pipeline through Saudi Arabia. And that is the pipeline that is stopping our oil prices going up above $150 per barrel, because this is the reserve pipeline that the Saudis are able to pump oil into the Red Sea, into the ports there. And so the ships either go north through the Red Sea or they go south through the Bab al-Mandeb, and it cuts off going around the Cape of Good Hope. Now, I think pre-war, this is only putting like 500,000 barrels of oil through it a day. Now it's almost at 5 million barrels a day. So it means that we're still getting oil through the Red Sea into Europe, and that it's still getting out into Asia. If the Houthis start blowing up those facilities, then this changes the dynamic considerably for oil price. That's almost certainly going to trigger major economic repercussions. But the other problem is you only need to hit a few ships for the ship owners to be unwilling to risk their assets, and that's happened. A few ships have been hit by the Houthis. I'm not sure if it's drones or missiles, but it totally closes the appetite for anyone to go through the Bab al-Mandeb. The thing is about Bab al-Mandeb between Somalia and Yemen, it's a very, very narrow strait, and both sides of it are hostile. You've got Somalia on the one hand, and you've got Yemen with the Houthis in it on the other side. Whereas at least in the Straits of Hormuz, you've got the Omanis on one side, Saudis, and then you've got the Qataris and Kuwaitis, and the Iranians on the other side. So what's been happening in that strait is that tankers have been trying to hug the Omani coastline, and every time they do that, the Iranians have been firing missiles at those tankers because they want them to come close to Iran so they can tax them, or so they can charge them a fee to go through. But the Bab al-Mandeb is concerning because the Houthis are less easy to negotiate with. The escalation point here is that the Saudis have started attacking the Houthis, and the Houthis are not afraid to strike inland in Saudi Arabia. My suspicion at the moment, though, is even though they remain at reach, or they're clear, they're Shia militia that are very attached to the Iranians, and they do their own thing. But I still suspect that if the Iranians tell them, they are controllable by the Iranians, so that they are really a sort of force at reach, a little bit like Hezbollah. But it's a really watch this situation over the next few weeks, because it only takes one of those storage facilities to go up at Yanbu, and we're talking about a very different economic situation. Tom, from what we're looking at here is, do you think we're going to be returning to that memorandum of understanding, albeit America more, not on America's terms, more on the Iranian terms, given what we know about the depleting interceptors and missile stocks?
Well, do you know what's hard about that memorandum of understanding is it didn't manage to negotiate any real understanding. It effectively fudged the single most important issue, which is who controls the Strait of Hormuz. Now, according to international law, it's a neutral, free shipping space, and vessels can pass through it without being interrupted. Effectively, it said for 60 days, yes, and then after that, we're not sure. Now, that's not really much of an understanding. So it was never a very good negotiation. It was never a very good deal. Certainly not for the US. It was actually a very good deal for the Iranians, because it conceded that they may, indeed, in the longer term, have the right to charge for their control of the strait. So it was a very, very poor piece of negotiation, and we're now sort of living with part of the consequences. So I think it's hard to go back to that. But your point about the Houthis and the al-Mandeb is absolutely right. I mean, you're right, about 3, 4, well, now nearly 5 million barrels a day have been crossing and going north through the Suez Canal into Europe. You're also right that other traffic has been able to go through there. But when I was speaking to friends of mine who own shipping companies, they were saying, the reason not to go through the strait, not to go through Bab el-Mandeb today is not insurance, although of course the insurance premiums are going up. It's that you really cannot reputationally have the risk that one of your ships will be struck and some of your crew will be killed. It's completely unacceptable. And if you go into the Strait of Hormuz, of course, there's a possibility that your ships will be stuck and cornered there for, weeks, maybe months. And that's really unpleasant for the crews who want to get home and so on. And it's very difficult to swap crews, because who else is going to go in there and replace them? So those are the two really big issues, but they're not the only issues on our plate at the moment, because what we've seen in the last few weeks is we've also seen another increase in activity in sort of West Africa, sort of sub-Saharan Africa. And I wonder whether we want to talk a little bit about that, because what we've seen in Mali is a real reminder that just because various problems drop off our the headlines of the news at 10 or whatever it is, doesn't mean that they've gone away. Now, you'll remember it was about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that a French defense minister used the extraordinary lines that the security of Europe runs through Mopti. Now, I don't suppose you could find Mopti on a map, but it is a tiny town about 100 kilometers to the east of Bamako, the capital of Mali. Now, none of us believe that's true, but what is certainly true is that the instability that we're seeing in Mali is generating another place from which we can see instability and terrorism and various other things coming into Europe. And the Russians are there already. So let's just talk about that a bit, because we've seen Russia activating forces to get migrants moving into Europe. So another form of destabilization. We've seen interactions with terror groups. Again, another form of destabilization. What are you hearing?
Well, I find it extraordinary from the US perspective. I do and I don't, by the way, find it extraordinary. One is that, firstly, this is a president that campaign on ending forever wars and interventions in the Middle East. And he's always been clear all his life, there is no point to war, it's a cost.
Yeah.
And yet, when he became commander-in-chief, he suddenly realized that he has all this power at his disposal. And he's really enjoyed being commander-in-chief and in charge of the military and funding it and then using it. And I can understand the attraction to a politician. When you speak to civil servants, they don't particularly like you, and they procrastinate or find ways to not do stuff. Whereas the military, you ring them up and they do stuff, they bomb stuff, they make things happen. That's just the nature of a military structure. And it's always an attractive tool for a leader. But what I'm alluding to here is that if he opens strikes in Mali, this will be his 8th bombing campaign in this presidential term. And that is not what a lot of MAGA Republicans signed up for. Many of them are isolationist. And even if they can find a just cause, such as Christians getting murdered in Nigeria by Islamists, and they want to stop that, ultimately they don't want to spend capital and their own people on these conflicts. So getting involved in bombing JNIM, which is the affiliate of al-Qaeda, and which is really rampant across West Africa. And what I would also say is it was given massive impetus after David Cameron's and I can't remember the French leaders.
Sarkozy, yeah. President Sarkozy.
campaign in Libya really opened up significant armories, which were ransacked, and it gave radicalized individuals or groups access to significant weaponry, not least with the pressure that was put on Syria as ISIS fell. ISIS fell in Syria, and pressure, and then more Islamists came out of Afghanistan into Africa. You've got this cauldron of Islamism, which has really swept across West Africa. And stood against that was the French in Mali. And the French government kicked out Operation Barkhane. And Barkhane was also supported by the RAF. British forces were involved in the logistical side of it. But when they kicked out the French, they brought in the Russians. And the Russians have been really quite ineffective at doing anything apart from enriching themselves. Now, they have quite a lot of access to the gold mines there, and those gold mines have been very effective at helping finance Russia, the war in Ukraine. And there's been this marriage of corruption between Malian leaders or African leaders that has allowed Wagner, which is now the Russian Africa Corps, to station their troops in their countries. But the reality is, Wagner, or the Russian Africa Corps, is vastly depleted in terms of money, resources, and quality manpower, because they've had their people taken to fight in Ukraine. And now you see radicalized, large-scale attacks, conventional attacks by al-Qaeda affiliated militants, but they've also been enhanced by drone capability. So you're seeing them able to deploy FPV drones, this type of technology, not at the scale you've seen in Ukraine, but they've clearly had lessons from either Ukrainians or Russians. And I've been informed that the Ukrainians training teams have been on the ground in Africa. And so you're seeing spillover from the Ukrainian war. I've talked a lot, probably too much, on just what a large scale and messy conflict this is. But I think my points here are, number one, Trump even thinking about getting involved in another conflict whilst you've got the Bab al-Mandeb, and whilst you've got the Straits of Hormuz and Ukraine on the go, and a lack of interceptors and a lack of missiles. Secondly, there is a real problem here. There is a massive Islamist problem which is not going away, and we could start seeing governments falling in West Africa. But thirdly, if America gets involved, I would say it won't be long till they start calling upon the French, European Union nations, Britain, to get involved at all. So it's like picking at another thread on a shirt. You don't know where this one ends. I suggest it's probably not a good time before the midterms for Trump to be getting involved there. But at the same time, sometimes doing nothing is also not a good option. I don't know, what would you do if you were in the government at the Cobra and Britain had more capability than we do? What would you suggest?
Well, I've been in that position before, and I'd be extremely reticent. In fact, it's one of the first decisions I made as security minister was to withdraw a small training team that we had in Mali. And the reason I made the decision was because basically the infrastructure of support had gone, and we were effectively training a team that was connected to, I'm sure they weren't part of, but connected to the only operators in the country, which were Russian. So, the reason for them being there had ended, and we had to pull them out. Now, you see this again and again. When things shift, you have to move your people. But I don't see how even the United States could fundamentally stabilize or turn around Mali. I don't see how they could do it. The thing that matters to us is the North African coast, because that, of course, drives a lot of the refugee flows into southern Europe. And the other thing that is important is the flow of money out of places like the gold mines in Mali, but also other parts. Now, none of that, I think, would be massively changed by having large-scale military operations in Mali. So I'd be very resistant to that. Just as I was resistant of doing the latest attacks in Iran, not because, you and I share this. Neither of us have any affection at all for the Iranian regime. We see it as a hateful organization of, terrorist sponsoring criminals. But the reality is, if you can't change a regime, if you can't actually overthrow a government, then you shouldn't start a process. And that is the difficulty we've got ourselves into. Now, these are not these are not the forever wars as they were described of Afghanistan, where basically we'd gone into a position where we'd won, we were stable, the whole thing was stable with a few thousand NATO troops. These are very different. These are very different wars.
You say that, and yet I don't see an outcome in Iran that does not carry on lingering, whereby they rebuild their capability and they secretly try and continue to enrich uranium. So it's going to be a forever stalemate. And this phase, what America has done, hasn't solved anything. And so it is a forever war.
It's made him. No, I agree with you. Sorry, I agree with you. These have been the war in Afghanistan was described as a forever war. I don't accept. That was a war where we were providing the endurance for the Afghans to continue, right? In the same way as we did in Germany in 1940 or Japan in 1945 and so on, or in fact, Korea in 1950. What we're seeing now, you're right, these are permanent. The Iran risk is that it becomes a forever war because you simply have to man the defense of the UAE, of Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi, and so on, Bahrain, and you have to guard the shipping as it goes through. Now, that's a very different proposal.
Whereas Mali or West Africa, if you don't have some sort of force there providing assistance, air support, and extensive training, then you are going to see cities overrun. I believe I think it's Bamako. They're certainly outside. They're certainly laying one city is under siege in Mali. In the same way, by the way, there's another city under siege in Sudan, but that's a different scenario. But what I'm saying is, the French, for their many faults, they did okay in Mali. It's hard to say it's a success, but they held them back, and sometimes just holding them back, that is the job of the military. Because as soon as you leave the vacuum, chaos ensues. I'm discussing something which is really hard. There is not a neat answer earlier, and I think a lot of people are war weary. But if you let these places become chaotic, you will see, as you said, the collapse of society, mass migration of people, and they're only going one way. They're going north. They're going to Algeria. They're going to Tunisia, and they're coming into Italy and Greece, and they're coming here. So, there's not a good option. There's not a good way out of this.
There isn't a good option. My own view is I would be against British forces getting involved. I don't see what we have to offer particularly. I can understand why the French might want to, because they have a much closer connection. I don't know if you know, but there's many of the taxi routes inside France are controlled by Malian families for various different historic reasons. So the taxi and Mali connection is actually weirdly very close. But there's so there's plenty of reasons why the French might feel they have a connection. I don't think we do, and I'd be very, very cautious about getting involved.
Yeah, which brings me to an area that we were successful on, and that seems to be slightly falling apart the last few days, which was countering Somali piracy around the Bab al-Mandeb, around the Horn of Africa. That unbelievably has reared its head again, and a ship was hijacked off a mothership in the last few days. And Atalanta, as an EU operation, which I believe, Tom, was run from PGHQ.
I think it was run. Yes, I thought it was. I thought it was run from.
It was a role. Sort of, what that did was it hunted the Somali pilots, and it packaged ships going through the Horn of Africa with protection from EU forces. There were Americans in there. It was a multinational operation, well run, well coordinated, and it really cleared up the Somali pirate problems, which, if you remember back around 2010, 2012, was a significant issue where Westerners or all sorts of nations' ships were getting captured, and then their people were getting taken hostage and ransomed for significant amounts of money or brutally executed. That's gone away in the last 10 years as a result of Atalanta security companies helping provide either escorts or armed guards on ships, and just better practice at going through these types of waters. But again, this when you see this type of thing rear its head again, that increases insurance premiums, and that has an effect on your cost of living, because the stuff that we import gets more expensive. The reason I bring that bit up is when we were part of Atalanta, our Navy was far more credible around 2010, 2010, because with way more frigates and destroyers and submarines, which means that we were able to lead that operation. We're unable to do that now.
Look, that's right, and it is pretty extraordinary that we've ordered some frigates and destroyers in the last 10 years. I think the last time we ordered them was in 2013. Before that, the last time we ordered them was in the late 90s. So for about 15 years, no frigates or destroyers were ordered. And these things are a bit, it's a bit like a T-shirt. It may look you can buy 10 on day one. If you're not ordering them every year, they end up getting worn out, right? And certainly if you're operating, do you remember when we were speaking to Tom about operating ships in the Red Sea? They degrade, the warm water, the salt, it degrades the steel, it degrades the ship much quicker. And so you just need to keep building these things so that you're having a constant pattern of construction. Now, actually, to be fair to the Royal Navy, that's exactly what they've done over the last 5-6 years. So now you've got a pattern of shipbuilding out of Govan and Rosyth to Scottish shipyards, which means that we've got ships coming off the ramp and have done for the last, whatever it is, several years. But we're still way below. I mean, all that's fine, but we're way below where we need to be.
Yeah, and there's two things I want to finish on, which are in some way relate to Iran, but also to what we began at the beginning was just discussing exquisite platforms. The two areas I want to discuss in the last 5 minutes are one, Tom has been again in Taiwan, and the reason I want to discuss Taiwan and China is the signal that depleted American missile reserves, Patriot reserves, sends to the Chinese should they want to embark on an invasion of Taiwan, because my view is that it suggests that America just does not have the industrial capacity to go head to head with China. The other thing I wanted to discuss is that the fact that I have been at Farnborough Air Show, and we've got the British defence industry, the European defence industry, talking about creating cost-effective interceptors and drones. But what I experienced was completely the opposite. It was an exquisite, cheap drone capability. Let's start with what your experiences were in Taipei, and just whether you think that what's played out in Iran really has any effect on the other theatre in the Pacific.
Yeah, look, of course it does. I mean, the idea that we can do stuff in Iran and people don't notice, obviously it's not true. And so people do notice what the Americans are up to. They do notice what the kit levels are. Do we really think that the Chinese would run out of kit? I don't think so. I mean, they are currently effectively manufacturing a huge amount of the kit for Russia and for Iran. And actually, weirdly, they're also making some of the kit for Ukraine. Because, of course, they're making some of the plastic bodies for the drones and so on. So, they're in some ways, they're arming all different sides. Now, look, I think this is really telling, because the truth is that if we are not able to maintain the production levels that we need, then, frankly, it doesn't matter what we say. We will run out. We won the Second World War because we turned the Austin Healey plant into the Spitfire plant, or whatever it was. We managed to make bulk out of what we already had. Now, where is the manufacturing in Europe or the United States that we can turn into the bulk? Now, that's what we should be doing now. That's what we should be using our defense money to do now. And there's plenty that we can do. So I'm not defeatist about this. I'm just saying that we need to be willing to do it. And the Chinese, they're watching and they're playing in this space as well. And I've just written a piece in the Daily Telegraph, which should be up online at the moment, in which you'll see what I mean. They are playing with the rules of the UN. They're playing with the rules of various different organizations to try and shape things towards themselves. And they're acting as bullies in the region. Now, we need to make sure that we're resistant.
To what extent do you think them taking over, like our still capability and then shutting it down, is them denying us industrial base or taking over companies and asset stripping them?
So I certainly think asset stripping, and by the way, this is one of the reasons why, while we may disagree on this, but I am a believer in net zero. I'm just not a believer in net zero in one country. I do think we need to address climate change as a globe, but I do think one of the reasons why the net zero in the UK alone is such a bad idea is because it feeds into this deindustrialization of the UK. And I think that's partly what the asset stripping is down to do as well, moving stuff into China and making sure that we can't manufacture at home. Now, that is really problematic for us now anyway, and should we ever need military capability, which sadly it looks like we're more likely to need every day, then it makes it much, much harder.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. They're different questions. You don't have to. I'm pro energy wherever it comes from, as long as it's cheap and reliable, and the sun can be reliable if you have the right grid. We don't have the right grid, but I'm absolutely against deindustrialization, and I really dislike the Labour Party and what they do to Britain whenever they govern. But I am pleased that Burnham does talk about reindustrialization of defence capabilities. And the Conservative part, the sort of Reform have talked about reindustrialization, and even if it's a national cost and it involves nationalisation of steel industries, I have no problem with that. But that is definitely for another time on industrial strategy. The final piece I just want to say is when we talk about exquisite capability, I went to the Farnborough Air Show this week, and an air show is usually has a lot of civilian capabilities and defense industry. This year it was very, very defense heavy. But what I can tell you is that it's still completely dominated by the defense major, BAE, um, Boeing, Airbus. They have the pavilions and the stands everywhere. And what they've done is they bought up small drone companies like Malloy, and they've made those companies more expensive. And they're talking about having SMEs on hand, but it's still expensive. It still requires a huge number of former military blokes or middle class blokes in suits selling this stuff. And what you've seen in Ukraine is they don't have that. They don't have that in China. We are over-regulated and too high cost in the way we produce equipment. And the most prominent display was GCAP, which is the manned sixth generation jet. I'm not saying we don't need it, but it just feels to me that when we produce the loyal wingman and all these other drone capabilities, we're doing it in a way that is slower and more expensive than our contemporaries. And my view is that there should be cross-party consensus on how we re-industrialize and renationalize defense capability to make it as cheap and as quick as possible. We should be able to make a frigate in under a year. We should be able to make a destroyer of a certain type in under a year, and we should be able to make these drones rapidly at pace. America needs to be able to do that. All European nations need to do that, and Britain needs to be able to do that. And what I saw at Farnborough Air Show was a million miles away from it. It was essentially exquisite, but slightly smaller, with slightly larger numbers, but still very expensive, very slow to make, and at the expense of as soon as an SME gets to a point of proving and testing a capability, they buy it and essentially kill it.
Yeah, look, that is not the answer. The answer has to be effectively trying to get the UOR system into the regular military. What I mean by that is the urgent operational requirement. If you look at what Ukraine have done, that's effectively what they've done. Now, we need to be able to do something different from Ukraine. Of course we do, because we need to maintain. And what we're not looking to do, we're not looking to build 7 million drones this year, which is what Ukraine are looking to do, because of course we don't need 7 million drones this year. What we need is the capability to increase to 7 million drones in a year or 2 years' time at the right level of technical capability. Now, that's really hard. I'm not going to pretend it's not. It is really difficult. But we can do it because we can partner with the Ukrainians. What Boris did, what Rishi did, what Keir Starmer did, all of them maintained a very, very close relationship with the Ukrainians, which is incredibly important, meaning that we are absolutely integral to their defense, and now they're very supportive of ours. Now, that is something that we can do to maintain that ability to expand when we need to, and that is a remarkable luxury that we have, but we need to actually make use of it, and at the moment we're not.
Yeah, and the UOR program should be turned into UNR, urgent national requirement. We're going to streamline procurement department, and the Ukrainians did it. American SOCOM has essentially launched that, and American SOCOM probably got the same size budget as Britain's entire armed forces. So there are models there that we could adopt very quickly. But again, I'd like to see this as cross-party policy to have a UNR department capable of buying submarines down to bullets and drones. This is a topic that is clearly interesting that we need to discuss, and we need to get more in depth into Africa in the next part. I suspect we're into a strange ceasefire in Iran. I imagine there'll be more missiles chucked in the next few days, my prediction is a terrible deal packaged by Trump is the most incredible deal ever, which will be fragile, and they'll be desperate for it to hold for another 100 days until the midterms. That's all we have time for. Thank you to everybody that's watched us. We are available on YouTube. We are on X. We are on Facebook. So please follow Outpost. Tom's Dispatches is a really good weekly read, and you're going to get even more interesting highlights from what he's been up to in Taiwan, which I want to discuss in more depth on another show. So please follow Tom, please follow Outpost, and share our material. Until the next episode of Warzones, thank you.
Thanks very much.
At Outpost, we are committed to free speech and shining a light on untold stories that matter. To support our documentaries, reports and podcasts, please like, share and subscribe to our work on Substack, YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Thank you.